Hello and welcome back to Our Story, 250 Years of the United States of America. Today is one of those turning point years. We'll discuss the start of what's often called the corrupt bargain, and one of only 5 times a presidential candidate wins the popular vote, but still loses the presidency. And of course, wrap up that story that we began in yesterday's episode. Welcome to 1824 in America. It's New Year's Day in the United States of America, and in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, there's a wedding. A man by the name of James K. Polk, who's 28 right now, is getting married to Sarah Childress. This marriage comes after the first year of Polk's service in the Tennessee legislature. And while this event is not necessarily remarkable on its own, we'll definitely hear more from James K. Polk in future episodes. So, in yesterday's episode about 1823, we discussed Hugh Glass and his encounter with a grizzly, his near death in the woods, and the beginning of his journey to track down his rifle. It's an awesome story, so please check that episode out if the story interests you at all. But picking up where we left off, Hugh Glass just caught up with Bridger, one of the 2 men who left him to die in the woods, and reportedly began looking for Fitzgerald, who he believes has his beloved rifle. From here, there's a couple versions of how this story ends. In the film, as you may know, Glass tracks down Fitzgerald, wounds him, then floats him downstream to a gang of Indians who finish the job. In the common folk tale, Glass finds his enemy, but chooses not to kill him, discovering an empathy he was not shown, and forgives Fitzgerald the way that he did Badger. What actually happens is a little bit more complex. And while it doesn't necessarily have the same narrative satisfaction as these other versions of the story, our show is always aiming for accuracy. Glass arrives at Fort Atkinson after another long trek and learns that while Fitzgerald is indeed present, he has enlisted in the army. A captain serving at the fort by the name of Bennett Riley informs Hugh Glass that he cannot kill a soldier, and if he does, he'll be tried for murder. When Riley hears Glass' story, however, he offers to find Glass' beloved rifle, and remarkably, after all these months and hundreds of miles, he's successful. Hugh Glass gets his .54 caliber Hawken rifle back, but never reconnects with Fitzgerald. He tries his hand at trading, but doesn't like it and goes back to trapping, and actually lives for another 10 years after this bear attack. He's said to have shared his story wherever he finds himself, that is, until he finds himself near the Yellowstone River, surrounded by Indians who take his gear once again and scalp him. I wish I had better news for you, but that's just how it goes. Unlike Glass, the legend will never die. He has faced staggering odds, fought Indians, fought a grizzly, and survived alone, wounded in the woods, and made it through the other side to tell his story, which I just retold here some 200 years later. The name of the famous film of his life, though it takes many liberties with the story, is called The Revenant, which is defined as a person who has returned, especially, supposedly, from the dead. And if we're bringing this story to life even now, and continue to do so, the story of Hugh Glass will forever cause that name to be a fitting one. So, what about that rifle that was the impetus for his journey? Well, shortly after the Arikaras kill Glass, they appear at the camp of some other trappers and pretend to be friendly Mandans. A man by the name of Johnson Gardner reportedly recognizes Glass' rifle, and the trappers kill the entire group of Indians in an act of vengeance. Now, on to some more stories from the year. On the 11th of March, we arrive at the formation of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, though this isn't truly the first time something like this institution has been formed. All the way back in 1775, the Continental Congress established a committee on Indian affairs headed by Benjamin Franklin. In 1789, Congress transferred the responsibility for managing trade relations with the tribes to the Secretary of War, and an Office of Indian Trade was established in the War Department in 1806 specifically to handle this responsibility below the secretarial level. That, however, was abolished 2 years ago, and all the responsibility for all Indian matters went back to the Secretary of War directly, which is currently John C. Calhoun. He administratively establishes the Bureau of Indian Affairs within the War Department without any real authorization. The Bureau is organized by region, with commissions for superintendents of Indian affairs granted to prominent citizens in each region of the southern, midwestern, and western United States, authorized to negotiate with tribes and oversee Indian agents in their assigned region, usually with the goal of facilitating trade. Worth noting before we continue this specific story is that as part of the deal that the United States made with Georgia to allow its western lands to be turned into Alabama and Mississippi back in 1802, the federal government promised the removal of all Indians in the state's new borders without specifying a timeline. The United States has tried to encourage the various members of tribes in Georgia to move west across the Mississippi, but to very limited effect. With John C. Calhoun now overseeing Indian affairs on behalf of the federal government, John Ross, a Cherokee delegate, writes to him and explains why the Cherokee will not be moved from their homes. Sir, we discover new propositions for the extinguishment of Cherokee title to lands for the benefit of Georgia. We beg leave to say to the President, through you, the Cherokee Nation are sensible that the United States are bound by its compact with Georgia to extinguish for the use of that state the Indian title to lands within, the limits claimed by the state, as soon as it can be done peaceably and on reasonable conditions. And we are also sensible that this compact is no more than a conditional one, and without the free and voluntary consent of the Cherokee Nation can never be complied with on the part of the United States. And having been duly authorized to make known to the government of the United States the true sentiments and disposition of the nation on this subject, the President has been informed that the Cherokees have come to a decisive and unalterable conclusion never to cede away any more lands. And as the extinguishment of Cherokee title to lands can never be obtained on conditions which will accord with the import of the compact between the United States and Georgia, it is desirable that the government should adopt some other means to satisfy Georgia than to remain any longer under the anticipation of being enabled to accomplish the object of purchasing the Cherokee title. You express a wish to have a free communication with us on this subject and to appeal to the good sense and to the interest of the nation, as pointed out by their own experience and by that of their ancestors for 2 centuries back. By tracing the situation of our ancestors for 200 years back, we see nothing desirable but much to deplore. The happiness which the Indians once enjoyed by a quiet and undisturbed ease in their primitive situation before the face of the white man was seen on this continent was now poisoned by the bad fruits of the civilized tree which was planted around them. You say that we must be sensible that it will be impossible for us to remain for any length of time in our present situation as a distinct society or nation within the limits of Georgia or of any other state, and that such a community is incompatible with your system and must yield to it, and that we must either cease to be a distinct community and become at no distant period a part of the state within whose limits we are, or remove without the limits of any state, and that it remains for the Cherokee Nation to decide for itself whether it will contribute most to their own welfare and happiness, for them to retain their present title to their lands and remain where they are exposed to the discontent of Georgia and the pressure of her citizens, or to cede it to the United States for Georgia at a fair price, to be paid either in other lands beyond the Mississippi or in money. Sir, to these remarks we beg leave to observe, and to remind you, that the Cherokees are not foreigners but original inhabitants of America, and that they now inhabit and stand on the soil of their own territory, and that the limits of their territory are defined by the treaties which they have made with the government of the United States. Through this and other letters signed by John Ross on behalf of the Cherokee to the President, Congress, and the Secretary of War, the Cherokee Nation becomes the first Indian nation to seek a redress of grievances through the federal government, and as no satisfactory response is given, this will lead to a Supreme Court case we'll cover in about a week, where the Cherokee Nation will actually bring suit against the state of Georgia, so stay tuned for that. Now, as anybody that's been listening to this show for a decent amount of time, or anyone that follows me on X will know, the entire idea, the concept behind this show, was to serve as a celebration for America's 250th anniversary. The idea first started sometime early in 2024 and has been a work in progress since then. 250 years is a big milestone, and I wanted to personally brush up on my knowledge of American history. And I found so many cool stories that I wanted to talk about, and didn't have enough people in my life to talk about them too, that now I talk into a microphone about these stories of America. As it is 1824 in our story at the moment, we're now approaching America's 50th birthday, and our 50th episode will be a major milestone, as that's a fifth of the entire show. Everyone from the president to the general American population is gearing up for the 50th anniversary back in 1824, remembering the hard-fought battle, the men and women that went above and beyond to win the revolution, and the generals and officers who laid plans that led to the success. By now, though, there's only one remaining major general who fought in the Revolutionary War. You may know his name. Lafayette, on invitation from President James Monroe, actually visits the United States this summer for a grand tour, partially as a way to instill the spirit of 1776 in the next generation of Americans, and partly to celebrate the nation's 50th anniversary. It's an amazing way to bring history to life, as for those born either during or immediately after the Revolution, they're now in middle age. They've witnessed the formation and continual advancement of their country, but this is a way to connect with those who actually fought and served in the Revolution. It all kicks off on August 16th of this year, when New York has a massive welcoming parade. Lafayette actually planned on heading into New York City on the 15th, but that was a Sunday, and the Sabbath was being observed, so it was said the city could not properly receive him until the next day. His arrival is announced in the Woodstock Observer, which writes, "The illustrious benefactor of America, the soldier, patriot, and statesman of our Revolution, the bosom friend and companion in arms of the immortal Washington, the steadfast friend of liberty all over the world, has come in his old age and full of honors to the country of his youthful glory, to witness its greatness and renown, to receive the greatness of his surviving compatriots, and to become the guest of the nation, the guest of 10 millions of grateful freemen. Welcome, Lafayette. It is a nation's voice that bids the welcome." Lafayette and his entourage head from Castle Clinton down Broadway and arrive at the New York City Hall, escorted by a military parade, and the route is lined by upwards of 50,000 people. Lafayette's secretary writes of this parade, "The general, attended by a numerous and brilliant staff, marched along the front as he advanced. Each corps presented arms and saluted him with its colors. All were decorated with a ribbon bearing his portrait. During this review, the cannon thundered from the shore, in the forts, and from all vessels of war. At the extremity of the line of troops, elegant carriages were in waiting. General Lafayette was seated in a car drawn by 4 white horses, and in the midst of an immense crowd, he went to the city hall. On our way, all the streets were decorated with flags and drapery, and from all the windows, flowers and wreaths were showered upon the general." Alright, now at the end of October, we arrive at a presidential election, which today is viewed as the first tally in the cons column for the Electoral College system proposed by Hamilton. That's not me saying whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, just saying what I see. For those that may want a bit of a refresher before we get into this story, I'll quote from archives.gov as to the creation, function, and implementation of the Electoral College system thus far, as it seems to be a pretty unbiased and just the facts account of how things have gone. Once we get into this election that proves historically contentious and largely brings the era of good feelings to a close, it will be important to remember some of these key facts. From archives.gov, the Electoral College is one of the more difficult parts of the American electoral process to understand. While election of the President and Vice President was provided for in Article 2, Section 1, Clauses 2, 3, and 4 of the U.S. Constitution, the process today has moved substantially away from the framers' original intent. Over the years, a combination of several factors has influenced the Electoral College and the electoral process. These include key presidential elections, such as the ones between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson in 1796 and 1800, the development of the political party system, and the passage of the 12th Amendment. The framers of the Constitution considered the election of the President and Vice President to be a major issue, and most were apprehensive about the obvious options. Election of the President by Congress would upset the balance of power between the executive and the legislative branches, while election by the people might not put the best person in the office. Many believed that Americans were too spread out and thus unable to be adequately informed to make such an important decision. Alexander Hamilton drafted the compromise that was to be included in the Constitution. Under this system, when a citizen voted in the presidential election, he was actually casting a vote to choose a presidential elector. In theory, a citizen's vote is cast the same way today. Hamilton's plan included 8 major points. Each state would be allocated a number of electors equal to the sum of its senators and members of the House of Representatives. State legislatures would decide the methods for choosing electors in their respective states. Electors would meet in their own states, each casting 2 votes on one ballot, each vote for a different candidate for president. The President of the Senate would open and count the electoral votes before a joint session of Congress. The candidate who received the largest number of electoral votes, which was also the majority of the Electoral College, would become president. The candidate who received the second largest number of votes would become the vice president. In the case of a tie between candidates that also constituted a majority of the electoral votes, the House would choose the president from among them. If no person had a majority of the electoral votes, then the House would choose the president from among the 5 highest candidates on the list. Voting would be by state. A majority of the states would be needed for a choice to be made. The vice president would always be the person having the largest number of votes after the president. In the case of a tie between two or more, the Senate would choose from them. The original Electoral College plan worked successfully for the 2 times that George Washington was elected president. However, a major flaw became apparent after the election of 1796. According to the Constitution, each elector cast only one ballot with 2 names on it. John Adams, a Federalist, received the largest number of votes. Thomas Jefferson, the Democratic Republican, lost to Adams by 3 votes and became vice president. The framers were not in favor of political parties and had made no mention of them in the Constitution. Yet, here were a president and vice president from different parties, and Adams and Jefferson were strongly opposed on many major issues, including states' rights, the power and size of the national government, and tariffs. The outcome of the election of 1796 would influence the way electors would be chosen as well as how they would vote in future elections. In the election of 1800, John Adams, the incumbent, again faced Thomas Jefferson. This time, the Democratic-Republican electors were urged to vote the party ticket. That is, Thomas Jefferson for president and Aaron Burr for vice president. 73 electors did just that, resulting in a tie for president between Jefferson and Burr. Under the Constitution, the vote moved to the House, where Federalists, desiring to embarrass Jefferson, voted for Burr, forcing the ballot 35 times over 6 days. Finally, Alexander Hamilton reluctantly supported Jefferson, and the tie was broken. The election of 1800 had several lasting effects on the Electoral College system. It was the first time that a 2-candidate ticket was promoted by a party, as well as the beginning of the practice of nominating electors who pledged to automatically vote the party ticket. This new development was directly opposed to the framers' original version of the electors as free agents, or informed, respectable, independent citizens from each state. By 1804, the 12th Amendment was passed, making up for the weakness in the original Clause 3. Never again would such a tie be possible, as separate ballots would now be cast for president and vice president. The election of 1824 brings to light an important point about the electoral system. The election of 1824 has several candidates as serious contenders. The official Republican candidate is William H. Crawford of Georgia. He was nominated by a caucus. Challenging Crawford and bucking the caucus nominating method were Republicans Andrew Jackson of Tennessee, Henry Clay of Kentucky, and John Quincy Adams of Massachusetts. Nomination by the caucus has been under fire for years as being undemocratic, and the issue reaches its peak in 1824. Okay, so that fantastic summary from archives.gov catches us back up to today as we come to a turning point in which it seems that none of the old rules apply. This time around, 18 states are to choose their presidential electors by popular vote, while only 6 states leave the choice up to their state legislatures. The electorate also features a new swath of regionally focused voters only recently enfranchised thanks to the removal of property ownership as a criterion for white male suffrage. In this new climate, regional endorsements of candidates by state conventions or state assemblies are, simply put, their popularity, rather than their congressional intrigue, will drive the nomination process. Also in this election, the Democratic-Republican Party splinters, as 4 separate candidates seek the presidency, though for now, there aren't any new party lines drawn. So let's look into each of the nation's options here. To some in the government, John Quincy Adams is the heir apparent to the presidency as James Monroe's Secretary of State. Think about it. Washington's Secretary of State was Thomas Jefferson, and although Washington's VP, John Adams, was elected immediately after him, Jefferson served 2 terms to much more acclaim than Adams after his single term. Madison was Jefferson's Secretary of State, and Monroe was Madison's Secretary of State. So if the pattern continues, he's a shoo-in, though the hiccup is the other popular contenders. Additionally, many staunch Democratic Republicans blame Adams and his supporters for having transformed the party of Jefferson into a disguised form of federalism, and Southerners object to Adams because of his moral opposition to slavery. The politically ambitious and able William H. Crawford of Georgia is supported by party regulars in Congress as well as having substantial footing in Georgia. Crawford also has served as either the Secretary of War or the Treasury across the two previous administrations. A leading war hawk during the War of 1812 and arguably the most visible candidate is House Speaker Henry Clay, who has a powerful base in Kentucky. He's already proved that he is a gifted public speaker, and he has support for his proposed system of protective tariffs and federally sponsored internal improvements. Finally, there's the firebrand General Andrew Jackson from Tennessee, the Indian fighter, the expansionist, and the hero of the Battle of New Orleans. This reputation gives him a popular standing above all other candidates, and he enters the race as a relative outsider, born to poverty, a defender of the republic who has risked his life in service of his nation. Some of Jackson's supporters even talk about him as another George Washington. Now, you may already know exactly how this election is going to go, but it's still a fascinating story. Now, the stage is set for this election, but before we discuss the results, we do have one other story to mention. So, as we mentioned when discussing the statehood of Missouri, Arkansas has become the new western frontier in that region, and the territory includes what is now the eastern half of Oklahoma. An interesting note I don't think I've mentioned yet is that the act of Congress that creates the territory actually spells the name Arkansas with a W at the end, not an S, a way of phonetically arriving at the French word for the tribe, which is itself a Illini word meaning people of the south wind. The first man to publish a newspaper of note in the region, though, consistently spells the word with an S at the end, as is standard for spelling French words, though both spellings are to be used interchangeably for a few decades yet. At any rate, here near the end of 1824, the territory itself splits in half, with the eastern portion remaining to be Arkansas territory. The western part becomes Indian land. And as the negotiation led to the Choctaw agreeing to move only 100 paces east of Bell Point and the fort there, to this day, as soon as you cross the Arkansas River at Bell Point, you are in Choctaw Nation land, inside of the state of what we now call Oklahoma. Alright, so by December the results are in for the 10th presidential election, and who will become the 6th president of the United States. 261 electoral votes have been cast and collected, and remember, majority, in this case 131 votes, is needed to secure the office. Popular votes are also recorded this year, in a move that places even more scrutiny on the upcoming decision. Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House, receives 37 electoral votes and 47,531 popular votes. William Crawford receives 41 electoral votes and 40,856 popular votes. John Quincy Adams receives 84 electoral votes and 108,740 popular votes. And Andrew Jackson receives 99 electoral votes and 153,544 popular votes. As is stipulated by the Constitution and the 12th Amendment, with no candidate receiving the majority of the votes, the decision must now be made by the House of Representatives. Each state will get one vote, and a simple majority will decide the outcome of this election. The House delegates will only consider the 3 candidates with the highest number of votes, in this case immediately ruling out Henry Clay, though, as Speaker, he'll get to play a role in the discussions to follow. It's a fascinating setup that brings us to the end of 1824, so for the rest of the story, you'll have to come back tomorrow and join us as we discuss the debates in the House and the subsequent swearing in of America's 6th president, as well as covering the opening of the Erie Canal. Those stories and more will be covered in 1825. Until then, you know the drill. Please give this video a like if you've enjoyed it, share it with somebody that you think needs to know the information, follow the show if possible on the platform that you're on, or subscribe, it really does help out. Believe we just crossed 250 subscribers on YouTube, an awesome landmark because the number 250 kind of goes with this show pretty well. And we're edging closer and closer to the 800 followers mark on our X, so all the support already has been great and I really do appreciate it, but I know that we can grow even more with the help of you, dear listener of this show. It's going to be an exciting Friday episode, so we'll see you then. Until then, this has been Our Story, 250 years of the United States of America, and as always, thanks for listening. This is an update to the episode recorded at 3:47. Here it is September 10th. And I just wanted to quickly mention that the goal for this show has been and will continue to be to encourage more people to love America, love the country, love our history, and appreciate the story of what made this country what it is. Today, or by the time that you hear this, yesterday, America lost a patriot. You don't have to agree with him on every point of view, and I do not. But Charlie Kirk was killed for no reason other than what it is that he had to say. And that is an extremely un-American, not to mention inhuman, thing to have happened. I do not have too much to say about it besides that, but this episode is dedicated to Charlie Kirk.